Up next is a topic that is prevalent now more than ever. The stigma around mental health has always been a challenge and is an especially taboo subject for people of color. Layer historical adversity, including systemic racism, healthcare disparities, and lack of access on top of that, and it's no wonder that people of color are at higher risk for poor mental health. Let's explore the impact of implicit bias in mental health and addictions right now.
Welcome the Director of the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities and Substance Abuse Services, Victor Armstrong.
We're in an unprecedented time right now. We're in the midst of a global pandemic that has revealed a lot of the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. We're also seeing civic and social unrest in our streets in reaction to a lot of historical health disparities, racial inequities, and policing. But where we go from here, the decisions that we make depend in large part on perception. In my view, perception is everything. But what is perception? Perception is the ability to see, hear, or become aware of something through your senses. It's our way of regarding, understanding, or interpreting something, a mental impression. I believe that our perception is built on a couple of things. First of all, it's our personality, our disposition. It's kind of that natural who you are. Some of us are more laid back, some of us are more high strung. But the other part is lived experience. It's the things that you've heard, the things that you've learned, the things that you've been taught, or the things that you have been socialized to see. Let me tell you about a situation that occurred with me about 4 years ago now. About 4 years ago in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I live, there was a lot of civic and social unrest. It was a result of a shooting of an African-American male by a law enforcement officer. The whole community was on edge. There was particular strain among the African-American community and Charlotte law enforcement. But one of the things that I used to do about that time was I got up every morning at 4 a.m. I would get up and stretch and run, and then I'd be at the gym by 5 a.m. to lift weights. Well, this one particular morning, I had finished my run. I was in my cool down mode, so I'm walking back to the gym. And as I'm walking, I can sense that there's a car that's following me. It's keeping pace with me. I can see the headlights out in front of me. I can also sense that this car is following me, trailing me along my right-hand side. Well, I know at some point I'm going to have to turn and face this vehicle. And as I turn and face the vehicle, lo and behold, on the side of the vehicle were the letters CMPD, Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department. So in my mind, with everything going on at that time, I immediately think, this is not going to end well. I'm walking in a predominantly white neighborhood. I have a hoodie on, and I'm an African-American male, about the right size for tasing. And then as I lift my eyes up the side of the vehicle, lo and behold, there's a white male officer driving the vehicle. So again, I'm thinking, this just keeps getting better and better. This is not going to end well for me. But then he said something to me that was very surprising. He said, did you know you're being followed? Now, I didn't know how to answer that. Of course, I knew there was somebody following me, but what do I say to the law enforcement officer? I just said, no, I didn't know I was being followed. He said, there's a fox that's been following you for the last couple of blocks. And we've had concerns about a rabid fox in this area. So we just wanted to check and make sure you were okay. And as I looked back into the darkness, about 30 yards away, I could see the fox with little ears sticking up, watching me. And about this time, I guess the fox must have known we were talking about him because he took off and ran across the churchyard. And the officer said, I'm going to go and follow him to make sure he doesn't bother anybody. You have a good day. I tell that story because people who listen to that story, based on your life experience and based on what was going on in the community at that time, you go somewhere with that story. For some folks, as soon as I say I get up at 4 a.m., they immediately tune out because they can't relate to that part. But for other folks, when I say I'm walking and a car is following me, somebody says, I think I know where this is going. When I say there's a Charlotte Mecklenburg police car following me, somebody again says, I think I know where this is going. And when I say there's a white male officer, again, somebody says, I think I know where this is going. But nobody would ever believe or suspect that there's a fox at the end of the story, because your life experience has been different. Your perception is different. So you took it to a whole different place. But what if, based on your life experience, your perception is incomplete or flawed? Are you, as a clinician, for example, finishing my story based on your perception? I would argue that implicit bias is outside of an individual clinician's or service providers, or even policymakers' conscious awareness, but it is woven into the fabric of behavioral health. It even influences a provider's ability to engage in truly patient-centered care. Because how can you engage in patient-centered care with me when you don't acknowledge or understand or accept my perception of my life as an African American through my lens? Now, I also believe that behavioral health is a very vulnerable profession. Behavioral health is particularly vulnerable to implicit bias because the diagnosis and treatment of the mental health conditions rely heavily on provider discretion. The provider's unconscious attitudes toward historically marginalized populations can have a direct impact on outcomes for individuals seeking a mental health treatment. Historically, only about 20% of Blacks get treatment for a mental health issue they need it, compared to about 41% of whites. Now, obviously, neither of those stats are great, but the percentage of Blacks that get mental health treatment that need it is only about half that of whites. We also know that compared to whites, African Americans are less likely to initiate treatment and more likely to terminate treatment prematurely. And outpatient treatment centers are much less likely to be located in predominantly Black, Hispanic communities. So all of those things raise the question, why? And I would say to the clinicians, if your immediate thought is to hang your head, I would say in part, it's not your fault. Historical treatment models were built and designed from a perspective of white males during a time when people of color and women were thought of as lesser. They were not designed to account for or accommodate the nuances of race, ethnicity, or culture. Even the way that we do our cognitive therapies, when we're trying to get people to focus internally, research has shown that for people of color, there's often a disconnect there because we've been socialized all our lives to think of ourselves in more of an outward fashion, to connect to a higher power. Thus, the faith-based community, the church has such a large role in our socialization and in the way that we make sense of the world. Historically, there's also a lack of diagnostic and treatment studies on mental health in African Americans. As a group, African Americans are underserved, understudied, and often misdiagnosed. We also know that there's a lack of diverse clinicians, and particularly African American clinicians. In 2015, there were only about 4% of psychologists in America who were Black, about 4% of social workers who were Black, and only about 2% of psychiatrists who were Black. Now, it's very easy to say it shouldn't matter the person's skin color, but imagine if I'm an African American male, how comfortable am I going to be going into an office of a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, 20-something female and tell her, I don't feel like getting out of bed in the morning, I cry all the time, and my sex drive is low? That's a difficult conversation to have with anyone as a man, but as a man of color, to share that with someone who doesn't really understand your story, what it means to you, is a very difficult conversation for people to have. Many clinicians don't have the framework to acknowledge or understand the experience of African Americans. Historical adversity, which includes slavery, sharecropping, race-based exclusion from health, educational, social economic resources, translates into socioeconomic disparities experienced by many African Americans today. Socioeconomic status is linked to mental health. People who are impoverished or homeless, or incarcerated, or have substance abuse problems are at a higher risk for poor mental health. Historically, there is a lack of diagnostic and treatment studies on depression in African Americans. So that lends itself even more so to African Americans being misunderstood and misdiagnosed. Also, what's very important in treatment is how you hear me. How do you hear the patient that comes into your office? And I'll give you an example. If we are looking at the diagnostic criteria for paranoid personality disorder, the paranoid personality disorder is characterized by a pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of others, such that their motives are interpreted as malevolent. But if you look at the criteria, the qualifying criteria for paranoid personality disorder, they read like this. The person with paranoid personality disorder will believe others are using, trying, or harming them without apparent evidence thereof. They will have doubts about the loyalty and trustworthiness of others. They will not confide in others due to the belief that their confidence will be betrayed. They will interpret ambiguous or benign remarks as hurtful or threatening. They'll hold grudges. In the absence of objective evidence, they will believe that their reputation or character is being assaulted, being assailed by others, and will retaliate in some manner. And they'll be jealous, suspicious without cause, that intimate partners are being untruthful. Now, keep in mind that you only have to hit 4 of those 7 criteria. But I would offer to you that a Black man may describe the pressures he's facing by talking about current politics, employment issues, and violence in his community. The patient may sound like he's coming from a position of anger, or even paranoia, but instead he's merely communicating the experience of a Black man in the United States. And I will put it to you even more succinctly. I could probably on any given day hit 4 of those criteria, depending on how you hear my story. Consider, for example, that a Black man who has grown up in a society where men and boys of color are disproportionately having negative outcomes when involved with law enforcement. So high vigilance in everyday life might be perceived as a natural consequence of racial profiling by a provider of color. But it may be perceived as paranoia related to schizophrenia by a white clinician, because you don't understand the context with which that person is navigating the world. You don't understand that person's perception. Consider that in 2015, African Americans were 7.3 times as likely to live in high poverty neighborhoods with limited to no access to mental health services. So no services in African American communities. Consider that African Americans, while we make up about 12 to 13% of the entire population, we make up about 40% of the homeless population. While African American youth make up about 17% of all the youth in this country, we make up 40% of the kids in juvenile justice and 45% of the kids in foster care. And consider that there are over 400,000 men and women with mental illness living behind bars in this country today. And about half of the people behind bars in this country are Black. So one would have to either determine that African Americans are genetically flawed and therefore predisposed to failure, or you'd have to believe that the system is somehow flawed and disproportionately channels Black people, beginning as youth, in their youth, into situations that can often predetermine negative outcomes. And again, your perception of which of those is closer to your truth will determine in part how you view your interaction with African Americans. There are critical issues that are faced by multicultural communities that can impact suicide awareness, prevention and intervention, and mental health in general. In African American communities, there's less access to treatment. They're less likely to receive treatment. They're likely to see poor quality of care, higher levels of stigma, culturally insensitive health care, have to deal with racism, bias, and homophobia, or discretion in treatment settings, language barriers, and lower rates of health insurance. Consider also that because there are little to no treatment facilities in African American communities, that a large portion of African Americans' introduction to the mental health system is either in the back of a police car or in an acute care emergency department, neither of which are conducive to good outcomes and neither of which build good relationships with the healthcare industry. Tackling implicit bias takes training and forethought. Clinicians should be able to see more than what is in front of them. To deal with implicit bias, you have to see what is living inside of you. And to truly see me, you have to see through my lens. To truly hear me, you have to hear what I hear. We talked about perception. So let me ask you something. Do you hear what I hear? When you listen to what's in the ground, buried in the soil of America, do you hear what I hear? Do you hear the rattle of chains as my forefathers were huddled together as cattle, sold into bondage? Or do you only hear the stories of slave owners who built America with the sweat of their brow? Do you hear the spatter of bloodshed and the crack of the whip as it pierced the back of my great-great-grandfather toiling in the cotton field? Or do you only hear the clatter of Eli Whitney's cotton gin as it spun out fine linens that adorn generals and businessmen? Do you hear the wails of African-American mothers as their babies were stripped from their arms and sold to the highest bidder? Or do you only hear the stories of the daughters of the Confederacy who showed their grit as they supported their men in battle? Do you hear the sound of the gavel as Black fathers were taken from their families and sold on the auction blocks? Or do you only hear the stories of today's absent Black fathers? Do you hear the cries for freedom from the bondage of slavery? Do you only hear the rebel yell and the battle hymns and view the monuments that were erected to the boys in battle? Do you hear the last gasp for breath as a Black man was lynched in the Jim Crow South for no other reason than being Black? Or do you only hear of the strength and mettle of poor white farmers who survived the Great Depression? Do you hear the screams of the 300 Black citizens murdered in the Wilmington, North Carolina massacre of 1898? Their businesses burned to the ground by a mob of 2,000 angry white men simply because they dared to prosper. Do you only hear angry Black protesters in 2020? Do you hear the spirituals ringing out as freedom marchers locked arm in arm saying, "We shall overcome," while being set upon by dogs and fire hoses? Or do you only hear how great the 60s were, prompting you to long for days gone by and seek to make America great again? Do you hear the cries for justice, for equality and freedom as I take a knee? Or do you only hear the Star-Spangled Banner and avert your eyes? Do you hear the voice of 14-year-old Emmett Till, lynched in Mississippi in 1955 for speaking to a white woman? Do you only hear the tales of Black male predators? Do you hear Eric Garner's stifled "I can't breathe"? Or do you only hear the often repeated "he should have complied"? Do you hear the screams of a startled and frightened Ahmaud Arbery, who, while out jogging in Georgia, was murdered for something someone thought he might have done? Or do you only hear their pleas of innocence and that they had to protect their property? Do you hear the cries of Breonna Taylor asking why she was shot 8 times in her own home by law enforcement officers? Or do you only hear how we shouldn't police the police when Black lives are lost? Do you hear George Floyd crying out to his mother, to all Black mothers, as he lay lying on the concrete with an officer's knee on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds? Or do you only hear the call for law and order against the base elements of society? So listen, do you hear what I hear as I place my ear to the ground? Do you hear the spilled blood crying out from the depths of the soil? Can you hear it? Can you feel my pain? Can you hear my anguish? Can you hear me? Because if you can't hear me, you can't treat me. And perception is everything. Thank you.